Last week, we celebrated the death and the resurrection and the ongoing legacy of Jesus of Nazareth. This week, we want to celebrate the death, unfortunately not the resurrection, but the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I think that the parallels between the two are interesting and important as we continue to think about Jesus, but also to continue to think about how the gospel is important in the world in which we live. In both cases, I think it's really important to remember correctly. That is, to actually think about who Jesus was and to think about what he actually said and did, rather than just some story we heard sometime. And it's also important to remember correctly the life of King and what he actually said and what he actually did, rather than the pop culture version of him. And then to go on to that and translate into, later. I mean, in Jesus we have this big jump of 2,000 years we have to translate across. In King we only have 50 years to translate, but it's still a jump already. And this is important. So I noticed that this week because in the newspaper, in our local paper, and in various media, of course, there was much said, on Thursday especially, about the death of King. And the first thing I read in the paper Thursday morning was talking to a local person who was sort of a scholar in this area in some ways. But as far as this person was concerned, the legacy of King was only about race. That was the only topic that this person mentioned. It was just about race, and it was just about black people. Right? So it wasn't about brown people or anything else. It was just, that was what he was talking about. He came to talk about race. And I continued to read through the paper, and I noticed that at the editorial, they said, yes, race was key, but also King was also focused, or was talking a lot about poverty. Right? And so we have to add the second part. Because one of the things that happens is that King's message about race, just sort of stays there. And it becomes a way to divide white people and black people. And so this is about that division, and it leaves out all the brown people completely, right? And it doesn't, and it divides. But poverty is transracial. Right? There's poor black people and poor white people, and rich black people and rich white people, and so it muddies the categories. And so I continued to read to see what was out there, and it wasn't until I got to the New York Times that someone finally mentioned the fact that King was starting to focus more and more on militarism as well. That this was sort of the third thing he was concerned about. That in his case it was the Vietnam War, but sort of the general problem of militarism, and as this related to both race and poverty. It wasn't a separate issue. It wasn't a disconnected issue, but that these three things in his world, in his experience, were very much tied together. And that part of King's legacy is the one that is the least talked about in our society, because of course it's the one thing we can't talk about yet, right? Because everybody's in favor of raising the military budget every time. I mean, this cuts across, right, Democrat and Republican and right Tea Party, and it doesn't really matter. Everybody wants to raise the military budget because, well, because what? Because whatever, patriotism, right, or whatever, right? So this is the one. This is the part of King's legacy that we don't even want to talk about yet. And, And so then when we take that, what's important also to do is to translate. Say, okay, so if King was alive today, and he was looking out, because otherwise he gets transformed into something else, because the translation always happens. We notice this so easily when we study Jesus of Nazareth, that in so much of our society today, Jesus has been transformed into a white European who is mostly concerned about getting souls into heaven. And that's sort of where Jesus is left. right? So as long as your soul is going to heaven, and you're sufficiently white and stuff like that, Jesus is on your side. You go about living your life, right? There's a song that, I don't even know if it's in the hymnal or not, that we sing sometimes. I sing sometimes. It's called, I Want Jesus to Walk With Me. Right? And it's this wonderful tune, except that it says that I'm going to decide where I'm going to go, and Jesus should just come along. Right? That I'm still the one in charge here, and I'm going to go where I want to go. But it'd be nice if Jesus came along to bless me in whatever it is I'm going to do. And so instead, right, what we sang this morning is "Guide My Feet," which is I'm not going to be the one who's going to decide. Right? So this is what happens with the legacy of Jesus. That Jesus becomes the nice white man who's on our side and not on their side, and wants to bless us in our extended capitalism. And the same thing happens to King, that he becomes, right, someone this week called him the apostle of nonviolence. Right, as if nonviolence was his key message, rather than simply a strategy to get something much more important done. Right? Nonviolence isn't it isn't a goal. It might be someday, but first we got other things we gotta fix. And nonviolence for King was a tactic. So the translation is very important. I am hopelessly inadequate to translate King's vision because I'm a white middle class male, and so I have no way to do that well. Fortunately, on Good Friday, Deb and I and Elizabeth went down to Charleston to see Reverend Dr. William Barber, who is very much still in the line of King, who did that translation for us. So he talked in extended ways about the three evils that King identified, and he says, and now there's two more. There's two more that King would say are now part of the problem that we need to address as a faith community, as a caring community. And the first one he mentioned was environmental devastation. And recognizing that this is also connected to race and poverty and militarism. That, we here in West Virginia, the connection between poverty and environmental destruction is just so obvious, because we pour, what we do out in the hills to the poor people doesn't count environmentally. It's only when it starts to affect, the water in the big cities that it starts to actually matter. Right? And so this connection is not news, and it's certainly not a surprise to anybody in this room. It was the second translation that was a little harder to hear, because the second translation for him is that he said that King today would identify as sort of a major new problem in our world, the church. That the church, has simply lost its way. It's lost its connection to Jesus of Nazareth. And so it stopped proclaiming good news for the poor, and they started proclaiming good news for the white middle class. And the good news for the white middle class is that someday you're going to be wealthy, praise the Lord, hallelujah. And so the church is... A couple stories. This week, I went and talked to somebody in the neighborhood. He lives right near the church here, who's very involved in West Virginia and the environmental movement in West Virginia. He goes out just about every weekend to some part of this state to talk to people about clean air and clean water and things they can do to make things better. So I said, we as a church here, if there's anything we could do to help, to encourage or support or just let us know. And he was surprised. He was surprised that the church was interested in this stuff and cared. It's worth knowing how low the bar is. It's worth knowing, because so when Jesus rose from the dead, he gave the disciples a couple of instructions. And one we talked about last week and the week before, right? When he rose from the dead and he appeared to Mary, and he said, Mary, go and tell my disciples. Right? So this isn't even like go out into the world. This is like, you know, right? So our job is to go and tell the rest of the church, hey, you know, we should actually pay attention to what's going on in the rest of the world. Right? And the second thing he said later on was, you know, go out into all the world and make disciples. And I'm guessing for a lot of you that makes you kind of nervous because you're thinking about like old standard evangelism of going out with the 4 spiritual laws and a tract and trying to make people show up in church 6 days a week, right? But the bar is totally different now. It's at a different place. I was at a meeting this week where I got a hug from somebody by demonstrating for them that as a pastor I am a kind and compassionate individual. That's how low the bar is. If you can say, I care about what's going on in your life and what's going on in the world, and so does my church, people are amazed. That's where the bar is. Right? That's what's happening, that people are genuinely surprised that the church cares about poverty. People in Morgantown, West Virginia are just, you know, when Ace this morning, I don't know if you noticed this, Ace insulted every one of you this morning. Because he was just proud of the fact that we as a church would open ourselves up to open the building up to this basic, ordinary thing that happened yesterday morning. And he was just like really proud of this. I'm going, like, that should be so obvious that we should do this. We're the church. You know, and right? And then, so, you know, like, this is sort of a bit of an insult to think that, wow, this is a great thing. No, this is what, I mean, this is just so, you know,
So it also spread the news to the disciples, right?
Right. We need to spread the news to disciples that this should be the standard. Right? So it's worth knowing right now, right, that going to spread the gospel means simply being a decent, compassionate, caring human being and saying, oh, by the way, this connects to my faith. That I go, right, one of the reasons that I can do this, one of the reasons that I can go out, right, and welcome groups to use our space is because of you. Because you're already decent, kind, and compassionate individuals. Right? Because I know other pastors in this town can't do that because their people won't let them. Because they're going to get too much feedback from their people for, well, the gun thing, we don't know about guns, or it was a peace thing, we don't do this peace stuff, or it was a, you know, poverty thing, and we don't talk about poverty in the church. And so there, you know, I can do this because, you know, you don't just let me, right? You encourage me in this. Right? And that should not be an amazing thing. That should be so obvious, and it's not. Right? So when I say to you, go into all the world and preach the gospel, right now all that means is go out there and be the decent, kind, compassionate people you already are. And once in a while mention the fact that, hey, there's a group of us that get together once a week and try to encourage one another to be a decent, kind, and compassionate people. You can come too. That's where the bar is for the church right now, and it's sad. But there it is. Ultimately, so much of this is just about showing up. Show up for your friends when they're having a bad day. Show up for your friends and ask them what's wrong rather than telling them what's wrong with them. Show up for your neighbors when something's going on. All right, when there's a gathering that talks about weapons or poverty or something, show up. Be there. Be kind. Be the kind, compassionate, decent people you are. Right? Proclaim the good news for the poor, the recovery of sight to the blind, the release of the captives. Go be followers of Jesus. That's all it takes. Amen.
Amen.
Our final